Good.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon and good morning, some of you in the West. Apologies for my technical challenges earlier on, but thanks, Shannon, for being able to accommodate me so fluidly. So I've been asked to talk about the sustainable development and the ocean and sustainable development, and give a broad background, I think, to this issue. So I'll do my best with that. And I'll do this from the perspective of some of the work that we've been engaging in East Africa, and particularly around trying to connect the concept of sustainable development to tangible actions on the ground or by stakeholders, by companies, in communities. So I'll do my best at that, and very happy to take any questions related to this as we move forward. I do have I've been working on this as a scientist with some publications, so there's some links on some of the slides, and we'll certainly share the slides so you can have access to those. You don't have to scribble them down as we're going along. So I'll start with the concept of sustainable development or sustainability. And I think all the participants in the course are professional in some extent in different fields working around Africa. So some of the issues I'll touch on will be maybe quite high level or academic, but then also try and bring them down to the basics. So the three pillars of sustainability, I think we all know quite well, is the environment, economy, and society. And these three aspects, trying to get them to work in synchrony with one another so that one doesn't harm the other. This is quite well developed, and I think probably everybody has seen this kind of a presentation of these three circles around each of these components, and their overlap indicates what's the situation in that area of intersection. Of course, it's in the middle where true sustainability is found. I mean, it's good if you can. I think in the past, many of the pressures that Shannon talked about driving ocean change and degradation have come from overdevelopment, rapid economic growth, over focus on profit and income, and paying no attention to environmental impacts and social impacts. So the extent that economic activities can take into account environmental protections so that they are viable over the long term is important, or if they just take account of social equity so they're bearable for people. But it's really in the middle there. Sustainability is where all three of these come together. The background document that you have for the course identifies some of the principal threats and direct drivers of sort of environmental degradation or ocean degradation. I have done a lot of work in the IPBES process, the IPBES. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And in that process, we identified 5 main categories of direct drivers, which all come from economic activity. And so there's land and sea use change, there's direct exploitation such as fisheries, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. Different programs may categorize pressures or drivers a little bit differently. It's not so important what the classification is, so long as we do really pay attention to what they are and their impacts. So it's important to address these direct drivers which come from economic sectors. But just as important, or perhaps even more important, is the need to address these indirect drivers of change, which really come from the social dimension. And these are the things that affect how the direct drivers of economic development, or how we clear land or use the sea, or how much pollution is thought to be okay. A lot of these are determined by indirect drivers, which are social. So these are demographic in terms of population growth and migration, political issues as well, or governance. There's technological and innovation aspects that affect the direct drivers. There's knowledge and research is very important. And there's a wide range of other indirect drivers like these, and it's even harder to categorize the indirect drivers than the direct drivers, and harder to act on them. But equally important in thinking about sustainable development, that we address these indirect drivers as well as the direct drivers to assure nature protection, environmental protection, but also social equity and economic viability. So I think the three pillars of sustainability are quite well known. But how do you implement from these, operationalize them? How do we move forward in operationalizing sustainable development? And this is where the Sustainable Development Goals come in. And I'm sure, again, everybody is probably quite familiar with these. There are 17 of them, and they're all coming up here. We often see them in a grid like this, all numbered together. And these were developed by the United Nations. They were adopted in the UN General Assembly in 2015 by all countries around the world. So it's a vision of sustainable development that really all countries have bought into. It's not perfect. None of these processes can be perfect, but it does quite a good job of covering all the elements, the base elements that we need to think about when thinking about sustainable development and across different countries. And I'll spend some time going into that. I think there's a couple of key things about the Sustainable Development Goals that are really important to consider. And this is true for sustainable development more broadly. And this is really that while there are 17 of these goals, they're really indivisible. You can't achieve them singly or in isolation from another. You can't just focus on number 2, for example, zero hunger, and make sure that nobody in the world is hungry without addressing or considering the other goals, because if you don't do that, you might have some very severe negative impacts while you're delivering zero hunger. It's a good thing to make sure that nobody is hungry, but how do you do that, and what are the impacts going to be? And the second main thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are for all, for everyone. It's not just for some people or some sectors of society. And this is the challenge in operationalizing the sustainable development or the Sustainable Development Goals, is making sure that we think through all of them at the same time and equally in order to to deliver on any one of them or the whole package. The other thing that I'll mention is that, so there are 17 of them, and a different group of people in the planning process might have identified 15 or 20. It's not so important, this specific number, but they do pretty much cover all areas. They represent 17 basic or inalienable rights, perhaps you can think of them that way, around the planet that we should think about in development. So, but it's complicated. This is a very static picture of them. It's hard to remember all 17 of them. There's a lot of work moving forward in more fluid sort of depictions of the Sustainable Development Goals so we can understand sustainability much better. In a circle like this, you can look at interactions between them across the center of the circle. And there's some quite advanced academic and statistical studies looking at the strength of these interactions. And not just that, but also looking at if those interactions are positive or negative. So in this case, this study, for example, was looking at interactions around SDG 14, which is the one on life in the ocean. So the one that we often use as our home goal in thinking about ocean governance and ocean protection and utilization. So for example, with SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and communities, there are multiple targets or formal targets have been identified under each of those goals. And so in looking at the interactions between the targets under SDG 11, so cities and communities, and life in the ocean, the study found that 3 of those targets have positive or synergistic effects with SDG 14, but 3 of them have negative or interactions. So you have to really think carefully about, in achieving, say, under this, in this graphic, the targets, the 3rd and the 4th columns there that are red under SDG 11, if you try and promote those without considering impacts on the sea, you would have impacts on life in the ocean. So you need to work out the trade-offs across the different goals like this. But again, this perspective is also very atomized. It's very hard to consider. There's 17 goals. I think overall there are 169 targets spread across the 17 of them. How do you look at 169 targets interacting with each other? And that's a mathematical nightmare, let alone when it comes down to planning. So there are more mechanistic models or holistic models that have been proposed. This is one called the wedding cake model because of the shape, which really expresses this paradigm, which is very true, of the biosphere or nature underpinning society, and then the economic activities represent just a part of what we do and what we undertake in societies. But there's an issue with this model in terms of really going towards tangible planning and actions, and that's in the order of biosphere, society, and economy here. And I think what's useful for us in thinking about ocean governance is we need to think about how do we address mechanistic interactions, cause and effect interactions. And so in thinking about this, I first took a very broad brush look. I wanted to think about the ocean as a whole. So this is goal 14. And as we do in coral reefs, we're very fortunate in our science. We dive into a reef and we look at it. We go and we observe it fully. We're not just sampling like in the deep sea with a grab that goes down to the bottom of the ocean and picks up whatever it picks up, or just remote sensing like from satellites, or using modern instrumentation is fantastic, but there's huge value in taking a holistic look and going in and looking. And cutting a long story short is in looking at goal 14 like this, we sort of came to this ecosystem service type model. So we have goal 14 at the bottom there, but also there's other natural goals, goal 15, life on land, and then 6 and 13. I'll go into this a little bit more. But the key thing is that we realize that from nature, the next step is the various direct benefits, or the things that we extract or use from nature that support our societies. So these are things like goal 12 is about sustainable consumption and production, 8 is about jobs and economy, 9 is about innovation, 7 is clean energy, 11 is sustainable cities. These are all very direct benefits that we can extract from natural assets. And these support the societal benefits or the societal welfare that we want to achieve. So no poverty, no hunger, improved health, and then equality across genders and across countries. And then there's some of the goals over here that relate to the governance and actually making all of this work. So I'll just explain this in a little bit more detail. So at the bottom there, just like the wedding cake model, identified these sort of biodiversity and habitats, life on land and in the sea. And then also these goals 13 on climate change and 6 on clean water. These are also environmental aspects that we need to manage, and we need to not damage them in order for the planet to work, or for our countries and local systems to work as well. So that's the base layer. Then the ecosystem service layer, this is really about the contributions from nature that we use. So this is the best language, but this is really the foundations of all economies are really based on where do we live? Where are our settlements? What can we extract? What are the genetic materials that we can use for innovation and for medicine and for new ideas? What are the energy sources that we use? And then number 12 really is critically important, is a responsible consumption production. How do we extract all of these different things? How do we use them? And this is an intermediate step. This is a direct transfer of material from nature through to people, and these things deliver on these societal benefits that we want to achieve in the top layer. And then somewhat different from these are the things that we need to implement sustainable development or sustainability. We need knowledge, so quality education. That's from research, that's local knowledge as well, and indigenous knowledge. We need to have strong institutions and governance in goal 16. And then we need partnerships, and people need to agree and work together to make all of this work as one. So this really establishes, if I just go back to a slide I had before, you can build up a narrative for sustainable development on mentioning each of the sustainable development goals in natural language without, resorting to complex language or the numbers themselves. So, for example, the health of the ocean and coastal assets, moderated by climate interactions, generate ecosystem services that support income and jobs across multiple economic sectors through extraction and use of resources, providing infrastructure for innovation, potential energy solutions, and growing coastal communities and cities. And these contribute to reduced poverty and hunger, improved health, and strengthened gender and social equality through governance mechanisms and institutions, stakeholder investment and participation, and informed by awareness and knowledge. And doing this, we're able to actually state the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, in pretty normal wording that can be reworded for different countries or languages or cultures and so on. So it really helps to bring the sustainable development narrative into people's frame of mind, and to explain it tangibly to any stakeholder that might be interested. So, and the importance here is bringing it from the sustainable development as an idea from the lofty sort of national and UN processes down into very tangible areas. So that's great. And the next step, I thought, is that we need to think in governance terms. So looking at this circle of the 17 goals, let's look at a coastal seascape, a landscape where, we're all working in one way or another. We might be managers or working in government or supporting an NGO or doing research. How do these goals relate to the place that I'm working in? Or how might it relate to stakeholders within this local area? So the next step in thinking this through was to think about sustainable development from a personal perspective. And in Kenya, much of East Africa, many of us are working on small-scale fisheries. So this is the model built on a household. So a couple, Hamisi and Mariam, he's a fisherman. She's a fish seller as well as farming and doing all the work that a woman does in a village household. And there, we can relate their lives to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so this slide is an exercise in basically just linking the goals to each of these individuals and the community around them. And so I've put them into the graphic there. Their lives are completely dependent on the reef system that they use, which is also supporting tourism and many other stakeholders. And it's managed through a community institution in Kenya. These are called beach management units, which the government has devolved responsibility and authority to the local fishing community. And they are able to set up a small protected area through bylaws if they want to do that, if they have the will and the understanding and the support to do that, to help rebuild fish stocks perhaps. There's also gender aspects, as 30% of all public institutions in Kenya have to have, there has to be 30% representation of each gender. So in this case, women. And Mariam's mother, for example, is part of that. So you have the goals related to gender representation, and then she's an elder in the community, and her health benefits are paid for through the income that they get from working on the reef. We can also then look more broadly at tourism development in their area dependent on that reef and the goals related to that, and goal 11.6 in terms of clean water and pollution, but also land use change. And there are many small businesses and tourism operators and NGOs and others that sort of are attracted to this area because of the reef system, the community dependence, and all the issues revolving around it. We can bring in an aspect of education. Hamisi and Mariam's son has studied in college. He's the first in the family to do so. So he has employment. But he also uses that employment in helping his parents with start up a cold store business, because he's an electrician, to market their fish. There's a climate and energy component to this story as well, partly because of the the energy use of the resorts within the system and the travel of the tourists to get there. But also locally, they can take a lot of actions to reduce their carbon footprints, to replant vegetation for carbon sequestration or restore mangroves in the areas. So that can bring in some carbon finance as well. There's a number of governance relationships that are important here, local and national government. And then the equity and the sharing, or how are the benefits from this seascape, the coral reefs, the mangroves, how are these benefits shared amongst people in the community, the different stakeholders? Does everybody get to benefit? Does everybody have access? Are hotels or, the wealthy prevented from restricting access to parts of the sea, which some have done in the past, because they want to have an exclusive tourist beach and things like that. So the idea here is to show that you can really bring the Sustainable Development Goals to the level of a local community, and use them tangibly in understanding sustainable development and how it applies to ocean assets and to the work we need to do in governing those ocean assets. I've also written this up as a more accessible story. This is an online illustrated conservation magazine at that URL there. And the value of this magazine is they assign artists to each story. So you get this beautiful artwork that's done for what may be quite a dry article, a scientific article. And so this story is also developed in this article, and you can find it there when you get the links later on. And then see if how can this apply to your context or to stakeholders where you're working. So the idea here then is to show that the Sustainable Development Agenda, and particularly sort of as expressed through the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the language that we have from now until 2030, this really enables alignment of all governance and sectoral frameworks. It's designed at global levels, and here I've shown the different global institutions, the Convention on Biological Diversity for biodiversity and nature, but the UN Convention on Climate Change for Goal 13, FAO for food and production, WHO, the World Health Organization for Goal 3. So there are global institutions that are tasked with or have a mandate in each of the goals, or maybe across a couple of the goals. But also works at the local level, that seascape in the center there. We can also bring this Sustainable Development Agenda into the work that we do in national and subnational contexts. And I think there's a particularly strong opportunity in the ocean to do it now, and there's a strong need to do it. I think the question that was raised, the first question after Shannon's presentation, about how urgent it is and how depressing it is where ecosystem-based approach is not being implemented. But there are many frameworks that can help make that happen. And while we come in from this, our community tends to come in from this perspective on the left, the eye there, through life in the ocean or life on land and ecosystem approaches, ecosystem-based approaches. If we apply the Sustainable Development Agenda properly, you could come in from any of the other goals. So here I've shown an eye at the health side, particularly relevant now with the global pandemic and COVID. And if you do it right, from any of these perspectives, the solutions that are identified should be compatible, or should at least the key issue here is one of the slides I showed earlier, is to make sure there are no negative interactions. In what you're doing in one goal, can you ensure there's positive or synergistic interactions with other goals, and ensure there's no negative interactions? And if each of these sectors does that effectively, then we will be able to apply that ecosystem-based approach or that One Health approach across the different sectors, and be able to match activities across different sectors in government. Those sectors, ideally, they should work in an integrated fashion together. But if they apply the Sustainable Development approach, even if they don't work in a very integrated way, they should be able to at least be compatible and align with one another's goals across different sectors in government. So there's a lot of power in this approach, and of course we need to leverage that and make it work as soon as we can. So I'll just change tack quickly now in the second part of this presentation as I finish up. Sorry, I think there's some timings in these slides that I tried to get rid of. And this is to show a little bit the value or the importance of the ocean in economy in moving forward. And it finishes with coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is a study that we did. WWF led this in the Boston Consulting Group to do the analyses, and then as CORDIO, we helped with the local framing. And what we did was that there was this approach to valuing the ocean economy that was applied at the global level in 2015. Then we applied it in the West Indian Ocean in 2017. And this was around, the beginning or 2 years into the Sustainable Development Goals being framed. There was an ocean conference in 2017 in New York focused on Goal 14. So this was really to try and help make more tangible in our thoughts how to use the Sustainable Development Framework in looking at the ocean economy in our region here. So in the report, we looked at 3 different areas. So one is, we focus on, or the Boston Consulting Group really calculated the economic value of ocean assets and production. And this was done to really make the case of how important it is for countries to do this, because the ocean's contribution in sustainable development can be huge and should not be ignored, either to not take advantage of it or equally not just to let sectors exploit it and damage the ability of the ocean to provide these benefits into the future. Second part was we explored current pressures and trends. And then the third part was looking at potential futures or potential solutions on how to move forward in a sustainable development context. So these are the 3 different areas, and we produced a report. I'm not sure if I provided the link in here, but I'm sure Shannon and Lynn can get it for you. And there are 3 infographics that were developed in the report that summarize the findings, and I'll use those as the basis to explain them. So the first thing that we did was looked at the economic values. So this is looking at Western Indian Ocean countries there, from Somalia down to South Africa and the small islands. And Boston Consulting Group pulled together from global data sets what we could extract for national statistics, and really looked down at the bottom that so at the right, the various primary assets that we use in the ocean. So marine fisheries, mangroves, coral reefs, seagrasses, but then also the coastline, the productive coastline and carbon absorption, such as in mangroves and seagrasses. These are very important assets. They calculated the asset value of all of these and added them up, and they were equivalent to $333 billion US. And this is the asset value of physical plant that a factory may have. So this is long-term value. And then at the bottom of the funnel there, the gross marine product is what they calculated as equivalent to GDP. So what is the annual value of the various goods and services that these assets provide? So, and these are in 3 different classes. So on the right there, we normally think of direct services enabled by the ocean, and that's 21% of the total value, sort of annually comes from these. So marine tourism is there, research and development is there, and so on. Then at the bottom there's the direct outputs of the ocean. So this is really fisheries, industrial fisheries and subsistence fisheries and mariculture. And surprisingly, they calculated this was just 9% of the total annual value that was received. And then on the left, you see the adjacent benefits from the coastline. And this is where currently Western Indian Ocean countries are deriving more benefit from what's on the coastline related to the ocean than what's in the ocean itself. And so coastal tourism, and then carbon sequestration, which was a theoretical figure. This is a calculated figure rather than what's actually being, the income that countries are actually getting from carbon sequestration. But the importance here, when you add all of these things together and look at this this gross marine product, the annual value that the West Indian Ocean could produce, this is a theoretical calculation, you line it up with the GDPs of all of the countries of the region, and you see that the annual output from this part of the ocean would, compared to the countries, would be 4th in place between Tanzania and Mozambique as as a national output. So of course that's spread between these different countries, and it's incorporated in really in the GDP of each of the countries shown there. But it shows how important and how large this value is, the importance of considering the sustainable development and sustainable use and generation of all these outputs from the ocean. And this is the overall graphic spread across 2 pages summarizing all of that. Now, and this is coming back to some of the things that Shannon mentions, we need to protect this annual value because it's so important. But there's a lot of threats to the system. In Western Indian Ocean countries, we have rapidly expanding population. The national populations on the left, you can see where this was 2017 when we wrote this report, so 220 million across the 10 countries. That will grow to 306 million by 2030 and to 818 million, almost 1 billion people, just in this sub-region of Africa in 2100. So that's an immense growth in population and demand and pressure on the ocean and coastal assets. We calculate, when we did this report, we calculated 60 million people living within 100 kilometers of the coastline. So population is a critical issue that needs to be dealt with. And then when you look at what's actually happening with the various marine assets and productive assets, we have shrinking mangroves. These are the percentages in Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Only 2.4% of the marine area was under some form of protection in the WIO, as we calculated in 2017. And if you recall, the target for 2020 under the biodiversity targets was 10% of marine area under effective protection. So we're well short of that in the region. We might be close to the level with large ocean areas, for example, some of the island protection in the French territories. But when you look at the coastal systems that are intensively utilized and under heavy pressures within the region, have very low levels of protection throughout the region. Coral reefs are at risk. These were global percentages that we were able to calculate at that time. And since then, at CORDIO, we've done the red list of ecosystems for coral reefs of our region. And all coral reef ecoregions in the West Indian Ocean are vulnerable to collapse. None of them are not vulnerable. And some of the island ecoregions are critically endangered because of climate change and thermal stress that's coming up. Fish stocks are in decline through the region. 35% are fully exploited, 28% are overexploited. So if you add those together, we only have 30% of our fish stocks that are not at full or overexploitation levels, which when you think about the economic development coming and the population growth, that doesn't give us much space to sustainably feed people in the future. And then looking at critical species, sharks and yellowfin tuna are highly threatened in the region. So, an infographic that summarizes a lot of these threats. And this is just one region of the world. The story is pretty much the same in other ocean regions as well. So the oceans, while they are a big frontier and, and are very remote, much of the ocean is very remote out there in the high seas, the threat levels are already very high and exceeding sustainable levels around most ocean regions. So then thinking about the future, scenarios for the future. In this report, we just considered 2 simple ones because we wanted to contrast the sustainable development scenario, or sustainable development future, or through blue economy processes, and we'll hear a bit more about those in other presentations, versus business as usual, the way we've been doing things to date. And of course, we keep saying that. Business as usual, when presenting in 2010, or we developed this report in 2017. Now I'm talking in 2022, and we're still doing business as usual. We still haven't transitioned to the sustainable development scenario. So the various drivers, indirect drivers here of population, wealth and production inequality, and environmental and social impacts, those all are projected to increase to alarming levels and under business as usual. And then under sustainable development, we really need to ensure that inequality and environmental and social impacts decline. Population will expand still, but hopefully we can reduce the degree of increase. And then this issue of wealth and production is an important one, because of course we do need to increase incomes, we do need to increase welfare in all of our countries around the West Indian Ocean, around African coastlines as well, because too many people live below the poverty line or are impacted by pollution and so on. But we need to do that increase in wealth and production in the right ways. We can't just continue doing some of the damaging practices that have gotten us to this place. We need to transform, as much as the developed countries do in Africa, we need to transform how we do development and income growth in order to not deplete the environment. So we identified, this is the third infographic, contrasted this business as usual and the sustainable development scenarios. And there's a lot of decisions that have to be made to push us in one direction or the other. Are we going to choose decisions that go to the left, in the red direction, or are we going to make decisions that go in the blue direction? So we identified 7 priority actions, and we attached them each to a sustainable development goal as their sort of flagship goal. And I won't go through them in detail, and just to bring us back to the earlier part of my presentation, and this is the last slide that I have. So the key thing about these different actions and how they relate to sustainable development goals is that many of them, you can't only implement them in a single goal. You have to think about the interactions across to other goals, across the seascape, or the mechanistic interactions that make them possible. So action 1, for example, implement effective management of ocean assets. We put that under goal 14 because that's where it lives, the ocean assets are in goal 14. But management is a governance process, and governance really sits in goal 16 and perhaps in goal 17 as well. 16 is the one on peace and institutions and governance processes. 17 is on partnerships. So even just action 1 relates to multiple goals, 16, 17, and 14 over here. Action number 2 we identified was to ensure sustainability of small-scale industrial fisheries and aquaculture. This is to ensure zero hunger, so that's goal 2 in the social tier, the third tier up there in the center of the presentation. But being able to reduce hunger, and for that to be sustainable from fisheries, we need to think very carefully about goal 12, which is the goal on sustainable production and consumption, goal 8 on jobs, which is fishery sector jobs, and how they interact with the ocean, with goal 14 down below. So that action as well really crosses 4 of the different goals. And so in moving forward and thinking about sustainable development and how we use it in the ocean, just to finish up now, I'd really encourage you all to think very holistically. While we always have to take decisions if we're in government or implementing projects and so on that might be quite narrow, or have a lever through a fishery regulation perhaps. So that's a legal aspect or a regulatory aspect. We have to think very carefully about how that projects into all these other goals, how it's dependent on success in other goals, and how it will affect positively or negatively other goals and therefore stakeholders along the way. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David.